Well, hello, this is Dr. Scott Langford. I'm here with Stanford Gen Global Educators Network, and we're co-sponsoring today with Foothill College's API Heritage Month. And I'm welcoming today a Turkish poet live from Istanbul, Mete Özel. And Mete is here, it's 1 a.m. on the following day in Istanbul. And like any good poet, he's up very late joining us. I'm just going to mention how I met Mete because I'm about to ask him about his journey toward becoming an international poet on an international stage. But I met Mete through an organization that is based in San Francisco and Istanbul called Artship. There is, in fact, another really interesting, fascinating interview on the Gen channel with Artship founder Slobodan Page. And so if you want to know more about Artship, you can find out that way. But Mete came into my orbit via Artship, which I've helped work with for some years. We've been broadening our definition of Asia in our Heritage Month. And so we've cast our net all the way westward towards Turkey. And Mete is here to tell us about his own personal journey towards poetry and wherever else the conversation may lead, since I'm still getting to know him and have only recently become an admirer of his poetry. He does publish in both Turkish and English translation. And so he'll tell us more about that as well. But first, let me just welcome you, Mete, to Stanford Gen Channel and Foothill College. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It is my pleasure.
Yeah. I do want to launch right in with that question I warned you about. I heard a little about this when we were talking about Artship, but how is it that you wandered your way, as so many poets do, into finding your voice as a poet and taking your poetry international eventually? What was that journey like? Like, how did you start out with poetry? Really hard. I'm really sort of asking you how you started out in life in a way. And I'm aware that this is a complicated and fairly lengthy story, which is why I'm asking, because I think it's completely fascinating and it will help people, I think, hear your poetry. We are going to ask you to read some, but I think if they know your journey, that your words will have even more resonance with them here in the United States. So how did this all start out? I don't think anyone comes out thinking, I'll be a poet. So how did that all begin with you? Where does the story, where do you want to start the story?
Yeah, it was started when I was in primary school. Thank God, my father was a medical doctor and our library is a rich one. And my father likes to read public literature, let me say. There are two main streams in Turkish literature, in Turkish poetry, two main streams. The first one is the old one from Ottoman Empire, Ottoman type of, full of Persian words and patterns, full of metric systems like iambic pentameter, like that. And it's very difficult to understand now in these days. But some people still likes it and still keep it in our literature classes in high schools. We are still teaching our students that ancient way of literature. But the second one is plain language, Turkish language, street language. Everybody can understand it. And my father was fond of all that poets. Maybe you heard about Yunus Emre, Nazım Hikmet. Orhan Veli. These are contemporary, not Yunus Emre. Yunus Emre is one of the ancient, one of the oldest poets, lived in the 12th century, but his Turkish is still understandable.
Mm.
So I read them and I pick some lines from their poems and combine them as if mine poetry, and read it to my mother and father as if I wrote them. Yes, and they like it very much because I take care about their rhyming, their meters. So I started with stealing lines from masters.
You know, they say that great artists, the minor artists steal, or no, minor artists copy and great artists steal. So that's great. Oh, and I want to throw in here that, like, so this part of your story was not happening in the major city of Istanbul, right? Am I got that right?
Yeah, I was born in Istanbul, indeed.
Okay.
But my father and mother came to Istanbul just for my delivery.
Ah.
Right after my delivery.
Off we go.
I mean, 40 days later, they went back to their village in eastern part of Turkey. It's a very small place, very highland, a kind of plateau. All my childhood spent in eastern plateaus of Anatolia, because my father was in an obligatory duty. He got some credits from the government, and after being a doctor, he had to fulfill his duties. And all my primary school and high school passed in Erzurum. Erzurum is not a small village; it's a city. With, at 70s, I was there when I was 10, 15, when teenager. And in those stories, I started maybe stealing lines in Erzurum. City of Erzurum is very high, really. It's about 2,000 meters from sea level.
Okay.
If you use feet, it's around
6,000 feet or so, right? Yeah.
6,500.
Yeah. Higher than Denver, Colorado, where I happen to be sitting.
Maybe. And surrounding with the higher mountains.
Mm-hmm.
The mountains and the nature of Erzurum and the culture of the eastern part shaped my character, I think. And my father likes traveling very much. Every year, in summers, we started from Erzurum to Istanbul from different ways. 1 year from north side, from 1 year from southern cities, slowly, and staying in all villages and towns. So when I was 15, I almost traveled all Turkey, including villages. I met all cultures, all languages. You know, in Turkey, some places are speaking Kurdish, and some places speak different languages or different dialects. So my language and cultural knowledge coming from those travels, those happy days.
Yeah.
When I was at the university, I came to Istanbul and study English literature and language department in 80s. And in 80s...
It's interesting that you chose, since I'm an English professor, and since I have English courses in English students, in writing in English students are some of the audience here today. It's interesting that was your choice.
Yes.
And was there, I mean, did you have a choice to study, I mean, could you have studied Turkish literature? I mean, it's interesting to me that you would choose English literature in particular, especially coming from, you know, I'm glad, I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm really glad that you mentioned thinking for my students, that I don't know that all the students that are tuning in today will know that, I mean, Turkey is a vast country with wildly diverse landscapes, dozens of different languages, many cultures. It's a complex multicultural society, and has been, always has been, remains so today. That's not something I think that Americans always know about it, because we tend to be ignorant of these divisions. But I think it's really important to who you are that you were exposed to that wealth of languages and cultures and traditions. And it is also true in English literature, since you studied it also, that we have a vernacular tradition all the way back to Chaucer and Shakespeare, who were really writing, you know, for the streets, for people, famously for the groundlings, for Shakespeare, and throwing in all kinds of slang from their day, and not writing in either high English or Latin, which would have been the really, you know, the way to go if you were an educated person in the Middle Ages, or even moving forward towards the Renaissance. So there are some parallels there. Anyway, that was a long detour to say, why did you choose English?
Yeah, it is indeed not with a conscience, with a knowledge. I I know that I love literature, and I want to learn English. So I thought, if I study English literature, I can be in literature, and I can learn English easier, better. Uh, I have no idea about what is exact function of English language and literature department. Indeed, after the second year, I realized that I am in a trouble, very serious trouble with that English knowledge, because my English has never been good, excellent for studying English literature. But most of our professors accept speaking Turkish in their classes.
Good. Oh, good. All right.
Because they one of them is Akşit Göktürk, is very precious to me, and he is very open-minded man, and try to encourage us to think and to express our own feelings, our own ideas, not the words of his books or others' books, but he would like to hear our own ideas. So he allow, especially me, to speak in Turkish, because it is always a problem for me to speak in English and express my ideas in English. Anyway, literature and books were my dream, and English literature department, Istanbul University's library was a heaven. Even smell, I can even now can remember that smell, old book smell, you know that. Very rich one. So I think Erzurum's and eastern cities, nature and geography, maybe people, most probably shaped me, and I merge it with English literature's people and poetry, and my poetry derived from coming from that that source.
Yeah, I
mixture
love
of.
that verb. I love that verb merge because to me that speaks to who I mean. As I'm getting to know you more today, but you know, as I began to know you, began reading your work, I think emerging, emerging,
Yes.
emerging, emergency. There's oh my, I can have all kinds of English professor puns here, but I do think that your work speaks to all of those together. And it was one reason that I was sort of drawn to you as a person and also as a poet, because I really value that ability of literature to cross boundaries, to bring ideas, concepts, languages, sounds, visions, everything together. And I think that you do that quite brilliantly. And it made sense to me then as I began to know you better that, you know, that your upbringing was in that kind of merging of languages and cultures and landscapes. And, you know, you lived in a small town and then you lived in now you're in
Mhm,
Istanbul,
mhm.
they've traveled, like all this kind of stuff. So I think that for me, that's something that I would really underline there. Oh, and I want to have another pause just to say, and we do have more students joining, which is great. I mean, I was speaking on behalf of students that don't know as much about Turkey as I hope that they do, and I'm no great expert, that's for sure, although I have traveled at least, right? Um, but we do have a fairly large number of Turkish and Turkish American students at Foothill College. As a community college, we have a huge international population. So it's not unusual for me to have Turkish students or students who have Turkish heritage, and now they're second, third, fourth, fifth, seventh generation Americans, but they have that background. So some of them may even be here in the Zoom room today. So when did you start writing poetry that was not entirely borrowed, shall we say?
Yeah, yeah.
When did that happen?
I
Um,
I think at university I started in
okay.
80s, early 80s I
As a
started.
student, so our students, I hope you're hearing this, that Mete started writing his poetry when he was a student himself.
Yes. Uh, and I have a good intellectual chamber around me. Some of my friends are very talented about reading uh, reading poetry, and they criticized me sometimes not politely, but it was very good for me. I always welcome sincere uh, critics, and I listen to them, and then I am uh, aware of the level or the color of my poetry.
All right. Well, so and then when did you start publishing poetry, Netta? When did you move? Because there's that writing phase, and then there's like actually trying to get stuff out there into the world, which is not easy, especially for
Mhm.
poets. I don't know that it's easier in Turkey. I would assume not. Although you have such a I mean, another thing that I can emphasize having traveled is like a, such a deeply literary culture going back centuries and a real respect for writers, I think. So maybe it's actually in some ways easier than in a place that is as cacophonous and sometimes unpoetic as my dear United States. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I graduated in 1985, and the next year I sent a, a file of a group of my poems to a very reputable, very respectable arts and poetry magazine, Adam Sanat. The Adam Sanat's chief editor is a son of Nazım Hikmet, Mehmet Fuat. He is very famous about his editorial and his past um, art magazines are very reputable. Indeed, I have never confident. I was not confident about the poems, but I tried my chance, let me say. And Mehmet Fuat liked them very much and started to publish them
Right.
in his magazine, his art magazine. Um, um, in those days, in early 80s, there are very few art magazines in Turkey.
Hmm.
Only maybe 5 or 6 art magazines, and it is the one of them. Now there are plenty of, maybe more than hundreds
Wow.
art magazines. Uh, I think all poets are trying to publish their poetry, and if they cannot find a place in reputable ones for them, they publish their own magazine
Sure,
and
yeah,
they
it's
publish
easier. Well,
their,
it's easier to self-publish or small publish now in the computer world, I guess.
yeah, their quantity is very small. It's, let's say, maybe 200 or 500 issues they have. Every 2 months or 3 months, seasonal magazines. But there are plenty of art magazines now. But in past, it wasn't like that, and it was difficult to publish
Right.
in a real art magazine.
Well, it's exciting that you found an ally and an advocate in the powerful editor early on. That was great, and it speaks, of course,
Yes,
to
yes,
your home
I was
work.
lucky, I can say. Maybe it is a coincidence because I know Mehmet Fuad's approach uh, when he thinks that this poet is important, this poem is good for Turkish literature, not for him.
Mm,
Maybe Mehmet Fuad didn't like my poetry
right.
sometimes, didn't understand maybe, but he thought this guy, this man is should be published
Doing something
for
important.
Turkish poetry. Many of young poets at that time started to publish their poems in that magazine, Mehmet Fuad's magazine. Not only the reputable and old poets, but very young. I was only 20 something years old at that time. And with me, the other poets, friends are also now, they are publishing their poetry still, and some of them are famous, very famous.
Yeah.
I'm not famous, indeed. You call me international. I don't know if I'm international or not. Yes, my poetry translated into English first, uh, without my information, uh, not permission, without information. I'm very happy, of course.
Right.
But that was a coincidence, I think.
Huh.
Fiona Tompkinson, English woman, a teacher, professor, was in Turkey, and she was, I think, trying to translate from Turkish poets into English,
Mm-hmm.
and she found my poetry and translated it into English. And English Poetry Society noticed her translations, and she sent, without my information, to the art magazine Dirty Goat. Uh,
Wow.
uh, you know Dirty Goat? It is
Sure.
strange name for a art magazine. This is Dirty Goat.
But it's a very well-known magazine, however, right?
Yeah, in Austin, and they published 6 of my poems in this in 2007 or 6, I think,
Yeah.
this issue.
Well, which is how I have quote unquote read some of your poetry. Because as far as I know, at least I actually wanted to make sure that I was right about this. You have not written in English directly, is that correct? Like the stuff that I
Yes,
was
yes,
looking at was in translation, right?
yes,
Because you
yes.
know, some as you know, sometimes bilingual poets will begin writing in both languages,
Mhm.
and you know, we'd certainly welcome you to to give English a try, but I don't know that it always has the richness of Turkish. But I'm glad you're also mentioning that, because one reason you know, I do want you to read some of these poems in translation, but I also wanted people to know some of this information, right? Like I wanted them to have a context for what you were writing and how sort of where this grows out of you. I am really interested like, how did you find yourself in a group of young poets back then? I mean, I admit that I imagine in my perhaps romantic imagination, right? Because when I went to, when I went to Istanbul, like most foreigners, I was delighted and astounded to be staying up late in the cafes, drinking tea with, with the
Mhm.
hookah smoke going everywhere, and just really so immersed in this deep intellectual cultural life that seems so much, I mean, to be honest, it seems so much richer than what was often available in the United States. I mean, maybe San Francisco at its best
Mhm.
could or can kind of keep up with that sort of intellectual ferment. So I have this notion of young Mete at the university with, lots of other artists and poets and
Mhm.
whomever is, right, just kind of sharing and sharing. But I don't know if it's true because I never actually asked you if that's the way it
Mhm.
was.
Yeah, when I was started to write my own poetry, uh, the political atmosphere of Turkey was strange. Uh, in 1980, there was a military coup,
Mm,
and for more than 2 years, they ruled. The Turkish army ruled Turkey. And after democratic elections affected in Turkey, uh, there was still army's pressure. I mean, guardianship on the elected parties. And if you have words to say,
mm,
even they are lyric, they are not political. My poetry was not political, but if you are a poet and if you are producing some ideas, even they are about law or other things, other than politics, uh, the big brother is always watching you and reading you. At that time, they were reading, and it was a pressure. So we have to develop a kind of language, a
mm,
coded language, hidden messages, uh, images are hidden. So, uh, yeah, some of my friends dare to write openly, and they accepted government's tortures, or some of them disappeared. I mean, government disappeared them, murdered them. uh, Deep government, I mean, not the official and the visible one. But as I said, my poetry was not directly political, so my poetry is full of hidden messages. So my friends, the artist groups, are always talking in another language, in a
mm.
hidden one. When we are even one to one, we know that somebody can hear us. Um, so the language was different at that time,
Interesting.
and our sharings are not very public, and we write them and send them to art magazine and pray to God for not reading the police or the other other people. At that time, the police department was very intellectual. Now I think they don't read anymore because everyone can write anything.
Yeah, the internet has changed. It's changed many things, including
Yes, yes.
in ways
Internet was.
good and bad.
Mhm.
But that's interesting too because I'm not I admit that I didn't make that connection to that very difficult era in Turkish politics. And so that's when you're actually trying to push your voice out more or less in the wake of a coup, in a time in which freedoms were really freedoms of speech and etc. were really restricted. How interesting. And it's interesting that I met you through an Eastern European artist, right, Slobodin,
Mhm,
who
mhm,
grew up, who grew up under a communist regime,
mhm.
and then only later immigrated to the West. And capitalism isn't always that much more fun for him either, as he points out. But I've always had a kind of affinity to artists who had the courage to publish, had the courage to be artists, even in places where it was not easy um, for that to happen. So maybe that's again part of this affinity that I have felt with you since first we met. And that would be great. Now I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, well, Dr. Scott over here has gone on for some time, and in a good way, trying to sort of place your story and learn more about who you are. But it does seem to me that perhaps we could ask you to read a couple of these poems that were, for us who do not speak Turkish, were conveniently translated um, into English. And you can give a little backstory on them if you want before you read them. But I would like our student audience to hear some of your poetry in translation at this point, and then I will be opening up for questions from the audience as well.
Mhm,
So I'm
mhm.
hoping that you had picked one or two that you might read for us.
Okay, thank you. I will read, and before reading, maybe I can say a couple of sentences about Turkish poetries today.
Well, that would be
Uh,
good. Yes, thank you.
as I said, there are two main streams. There were, but with the start of 20th century, after Nazım Hikmet, I can say, the old-fashioned and full of Persian words and patterns and metric system uh, fade out, and uh, without rhyming and without meters.
Hmm.
Nazım Hikmet is a very revolutionist man in Turkish literature and set up a new way of saying, uh, writing poems. After him, now it is very difficult to make rhyming in Turkish. It is very old-fashioned because, but the rhyming, I mean, harmony is in the lines, some
Okay.
of them maybe. Uh,
So in
and
other words, what you're saying, like for my English literature students, what you're saying is that very much like English and American literature, then kind of at the turn of the 20th century, there was a movement away from more strictly rhymed poetry towards what we would call loosely free verse. Am
yes,
I
free
hearing
verse.
that correctly? So if you're an English literature student, I'm
Yes.
counting on you to not let me overstate the equivalence if it's not there. But it actually sounds, even in terms of time frame, it sounds rather familiar. So it's interesting that that would be the case, and maybe not surprising also because, as you know, I'll remind students, I mean, you know, Turkey has participated in Western European culture, and Western European culture has participated in Turkish culture for centuries. It's always been this amazing cross pollination. So maybe this is another instance. I mean, James Baldwin, among many other like beloved American authors, took up residency in Istanbul in the mid 20th century because he found it to be so stimulating, amazing. So, so I'm just hearing with my English literature professor hat on. I'm hearing, I guess, hoping that they're at least homologous, if not analogous, to the situation there. So what you'll be reading another, so it was translated. So it's not that it's necessarily losing rhyme being translated into English, or at least not direct rhyme, right? Is that what I'm hearing in a way?
Mhm. If you like, I can read some Turkish
Yes, I
and
would like.
English together so you can hear our beautiful language too. Turkish is a very different language than Indo-European languages. It is Altaic one, and it's a kind of mathematical language. Maybe you heard it. It is full of suffixes. For one root, we add all grammar on one word and construct the sentences in one word. Maybe in English, 19, 20 words can be said in one Turkish word.
Yeah, so which
Long
means
words.
it is notoriously difficult to translate, however, also.
Yeah, it is. It is a little bit, yes.
Yeah, so for one Turkish word, we're going to need like 10 English words because English just can't carry that weight, maybe. I don't
The
know.
average is 3 or 4, but the extreme examples I can find extreme examples. Let me read first in English, then for in Turkish, just for your ears and
That's a great idea.
comparison. Okay. The name of this poem is Blackbird. Mountain under the snow, waiting with its sharp pointed towers. My legs are being broken one by one. My arms, my backbone, my neck, it hurts no more. Mountain waiting in its frozen dragon, wriggling in agony. Snow sliders rolling down its slopes, giving off sparks under the moon. My mind turns into a black bird, flies away and perches on the horizon. It appears no more. The Turkish translation of this poem is, the Turkish original is like that. Karakuş, dağ, karın altında sivri kuleleriyle bekliyor. Bacaklarım bir bir kırılıyor. Kollarım, belim, boynum daha acımıyor canım. Dağ bekliyor donmuş ejderhası içinde. Sancıyla kıvranıyor. Çığlar akıyor yamacından. Kıvılcımlanıyor ayın altında. Kara bir kuş oluyor aklım. Gidip ufka donuyor. Daha göze görünmüyor. My friend Cihat Salman translated it into English, and he tried to keep, I think, the inner harmony of, I don't know what your feeling about it.
No, I felt some of that in the, and also, some universal elements of poetry to some degree, the repetition of key words and the kind of close rhymes, even if they're not rhymes. So, I mean, it's interesting that the music of it is not, it's more beautiful in Turkish, but I can hear how hard your translator worked to try to make English sound that way. And then, I'll also comment that you were mentioning that you had grown up in this very mountainous region of Turkey. And so the landscape seems to me, at least, to speak to that part of your experience. And since I was a mountaineer, once upon a time in my hazy youth, I think this was literally the first poem of yours that I read in translation, and I'm so glad that it's the one you started with, because it was one of those places where I thought, oh wow, I've got to read more of this man's poetry. It does speak to me as someone for whom mountain landscapes are fundamental, and it did carry my mind away over the peaks. So thank you for starting with that one.
Yeah, I think in most of my poems, mountain is the main character, maybe. I was skiing when I was in Erzurum, and I stay in the mountains alone for a long time. and I listened to the mountain. I said something to the mountain. I kept them in my mind. Then I wrote. I tried to wrote. This is, I think, it's not about mountains. It's a very short one. The name of the poem is Shame. O ton Adonin, O ton Adonin. When it rains, the soil remembers herself, remembers who dropped his seeds where, the cocoon breaking in agony shall incubate its twin in exact shape it was before and shall greet its new life. I, my love, was soil, soil, and I bled to death, then was reborn with the rain and ran to you with glowing Manisa tulips at my cuffs. That's it.
That is such a sensual and beautiful poem.
Thank you.
So yes, and we would love to hear it in Turkish now, if we may.
Yes, it is starting again with the same O ton Adonin, O ton Adonin. O ton Adonin means ah Adonis, wah Adonis, ah, they're crying after Adonis.
Yes.
They are crying, the women, of course. And the name of this poem in Turkish is Utanç. Yağmur yağınca toprak hatırlıyor kendini. Kim nereye düşürmüştü tohumunu? Acıyla çatlayan koza, önce tam da nasılsa öyle üretecek ikizini ve selamlayacak yeni hayatını. Ben sevgilim topraktım toprak ve kanayarak ölüp yağmurla doğarak yine koştum sana. Paçalarımda coşkun Manisa laleleri. That's it.
You know, so again, I get to be the first commenter, and then I think I would like to open it up and see if students want to ask questions or other faculty members who are here. You know, a couple of the images that really struck me and stick with me now, that the soil remembers, I think is a deep, deep line. And you spoke of the roots of literature and poetry in Turkey going back centuries and centuries and centuries. The roots in the land, and I think that invokes that as does Adonis and the opening as well, that sort of epic opening. But then it shifts into a poem of love. It's a very sensuous poem, and yet it also, the soil bleeds, which cuts literally in that other direction. So I feel my heart sort of thrown this way and thrown this way in a way that's quite powerful. A rather stormy and deep poem in that way. And it comes, again, you know, I wish that I could hear it fully in the original language, but this is always the limitation of translation.
Yeah.
But I think the translator did a brilliant job. And I think that it still lives and breathes in English. Maybe
it is again just Salman's translation,
but it does. So thank you for that poem. It was beautiful.
I thank you, really.
Now let me ask you, or let me ask if students want to step in with questions at this point. You can either put them in the chat, or we can unmute you. I mean, it's actually better if you ask to be unmuted. We're happy to do that for you. But if you're feeling a little shy, you can also type questions in there. And you know, since a lot of you are my students, you know that I am fully capable of going on and on. So you don't necessarily have to rescue me or Mete, but I do think it would be, and we have quite a bit earlier question from Addie, and I'll go ahead and read this one. you spoke to this already, but maybe we can circle back to it, right? Now speaking as, speaking as an adult, speaking as someone whose poetry has been translated into English and has found an audience over here on the other side of the world. Daddy wanted to know what drew you to poetry. So I wouldn't mind having you circle back to that question.
Yeah, just for telling my love to the beautiful girls, I think, drew my poetry.
Well,
At
you
first,
would
it was
never
like
go and
that.
say
Yeah.
that, would you?
My stealing lines from famous Turkish poets are from my mother when I was in primary school, when I was a child. But then, when, at the university or later, I think love drew me to write poetry.
All right. Well, we've got lots of comments saying, I love that answer, and that's a beautiful answer. And Daniel wants to know, and again, you kind of talked to this, but I like the circling back. So Daniel's asking, how long have you been doing poetry now? I guess this is one of those, like, since we're both men of a certain age,
Yeah,
so how many, has this been 2 years or 3 years since you graduated from university? Is kind of
yes.
question.
But I was not writing frequently. Once or twice, or at most, I think 6 poems a year I can write. It depends on my readings, and it depends on the feelings, maybe. I'm not all the time producing poetry. I can't. For last maybe 4 years, I wrote 4 or 5 poems, and this line length is 1 page or 2 pages, maybe at most.
And do you feel that your poetry has changed as you've aged? Do you feel like you are fundamentally the same poet that you were when you were a student, or do you feel that you're fundamentally not the same poet as when you were a student? Like, how does that feel for you?
I hope, Scott. I hope I can change my poetry, because I'm changed. I'm not the man 40 years ago, 30 years ago. I'm a very different man now.
Yeah.
And the way of saying something maybe not changed, but the ideas are changed, and I hope my poetry changed, and it is now modern. I mean, today's
Yeah, well, here we are in
poetry.
the 21st century, right? Like,
Yes,
Simon and I
yes.
from the 20th century, so you kind of are too. So, like, yeah, we are speaking in a whole new century, literally, right?
Yeah.
And a very different Turkey as well, right? I mean, very obviously, I think Turkey is also a very different place than it was in the 60s or the 80s or even the 2000s. So we change ourselves physically, mentally, spiritually, but of course, the place that we call home changes as well. And that can change your voice too, in a brilliant way. Were those so? And then I'm curious, were those so? Where in the canon of Mete Özel were those fairly early, more recent, sort of middle, or were those two? Where were those two poems kind of coming from?
These poems are from 90s, not very fresh ones.
Yeah.
From 90s, I can say, yes.
Yeah, well, and I'll say this to students as well. Like, one of the reasons I think that one does poetry or writing is that it's almost like a photograph of that time in your life, right? Except with so many more colors and dimensions. So in the same way that you can go back and look at a photograph of yourself as a younger man or as a boy, you can go back to these poems that you wrote many years before and see that person that you were then and it's beautiful in a way. Like, it doesn't mean that you have to still be that person, but it means it's a way of looking back in your own time and life. Oh, I see that's, oh, Stephanie. Stephanie, do you want to, shall we unmute you and you can ask that question for yourself? This is my colleague, Stephanie Chan. Let's see if I can unmute her, or if someone else can. It's faster on the draw than I am. Just to unmute. There, I asked to unmute to see if she wanted to ask it. Otherwise, I'll just read it for you.
I can ask it. I had some leaf blowers outside, so I
Oh, okay. Go right ahead, Stephanie.
This was lovely. Thank you, Mete, for sharing and for writing these poems. It's just and teaching us so much about the style and the kind of impetus for the poetry. So I was really interested in your discussion about the earlier poems that incorporated the secret language to avoid surveillance, the big brother, and just, you know, being really self-conscious about what you're saying to one another. And you know, I always love the idea of poetry as being a form for artists and for thinkers to encode thought. So I wonder if, I have two questions. I wonder if you, at this moment, incorporate any of that kind of language. I mean, may not be for the same reasons as the earlier moment you're talking about, but is that something that you think about when you make your poems? And then the other question was about how that might or might not make it into translation. So if we look at some of these earlier poems that do have the secret language, what happens when they become translated? Is there any way that you can preserve the secrecy, or is that something that's important to you as a poet who is kind of working because you've been translated between languages? So any of that would be wonderful to hear you talk about. Thank you.
I thank you, Stephanie. I can say first, yes, I'm still using. I have to using coded secret language. Only certain people can understand it with all layers. Maybe first layer everybody can read and enjoy, but the second and third and deeper, I have to build up like that, because it is still not. We are still living in a country not fully democratic, and we have some concerns about our today, our future. To be a poet is always a serious thing, a dangerous thing, I mean, in such a country. About translation, I also try to translate some poems from Turkish to English and from English to Turkish. And it is really a difficult one. It is really difficult, especially if the poems contains local cultural elements. If you cannot find the correlatives in the target's culture, it is sometimes impossible. And you know, the one of the definition, one of the exclamation of the poem is what is lost in translation. The poem is what is lost in translation. I try to translate it, one of Turkish poets, Mete Özel, into English. And his book is reckoning poems. Mete Özel was murdered in Sivas. He was fired there together with 32 artists. Most of them are very young. In 1992, maybe you heard it. In Sivas, people attacked them in a hotel, in Madımak Hotel, and they fired them. And Mete Özel was not very young, but he's very matured and very producing a good poet, right in Turkish. I translated his book into English, and one of my friends in the United States, April Chappell, edited them. Maybe I can share it. I can share some of them with Scott, and he can pass them to you. He calculated all letters and words in Turkish and construct his poems as if they are pictures. For example, one of his poems is about divan. You know, divan means sofa, chair, to sit or lay down. But at the same time, divan means collection of poetry of a man, of a poet. Divan means at the same time a kind of musical instruments.
Wow.
Divan at the same time means meeting room of the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, wow.
He put the letters as if it is a sofa, divan, but divan also means Ottoman type of poetry. And karşı divan means opposite sofa. He put the letters as if the mirror image of sofa, and criticized Ottoman poetry, old poetry. When I try to translate it into English, I have to make many definitions. Divan means like that. This is like that. It is maybe impossible, but without a translation, who will know about Mete Özel? How can I read Aragon? How can I read even Shakespeare? I know a little bit English. I try to read him in English, but some of our talented, very talented translators translated Shakespeare, Molière, Aragon into Turkish, and I love them. And they also shaped me. They also give a beautiful world to me. We have to translate. Somebody who is talented, who is willing, had to translate good things into the other languages. Otherwise, all cultures can be very lonely. So yes, it is very difficult, but in some point it is possible, and the intellectual people can regard the difficulties and missing parts that can be, but he can get the main idea, main image, and maybe a part of the taste of that piece, that art piece, I mean.
Well, that was a beautiful answer about translation. I thought that was so.
Thank you.
That was a layered answer about the layering of translation, and that did seem like an extremely difficult poet to choose to translate. You know, which is fine. We're running a little long, but what I'm thinking, Mete, is if you would share with us one or two more poems, I think that would be a lovely way to kind of come full circle here. Some students will be leaving for other obligations, because this is originally advertised as a 1-hour event, and it's rather late in Istanbul. So at some point we might let you off duty. But if you have one or two more poems to share for us, I think that would be a lovely way to bring things to a close. So please do.
Okay. This is English name is Rob. And it's starting with a line from Wallace Stevens, that is the mother of beauty. Fog over the moonlit waters, an oyster on the boat, the mother of beauty is calling, with the essence of my poem in her white breasts. The oval of the fragile time that tied me crashed upon the dark branches and poured over me. Oh, oppressed beauty of the truth. Destitute, dim flicker of life, I'm living. Hold the dirty rope of this boat. Turkish. Do you like to listen Turkish?
Yes, yes, definitely. I think it's really enriched the reading. Thank you.
Okay. Ölüm güzelliğin annesidir. Ay sularında sis, teknede istiridye. Güzelliğin annesi çağırıyor ak memelerinde özü şiirimin. Beni bağlayan sırça zaman puhusu karanlık dallara çarpıp tepeme yağdı. Ey gerçeğin ezilmiş güzeli, yoksul yakamozu dirimin, gidiyorum tut şu teknenin kirli ipini. And maybe this one will be the last one. Or if you have time, I can read one more.
I think
This is Mountain Song.
we'll do one more just because of the damn clock, not because I don't want.
Yeah, okay. Two lines of this poem was carved in stones by sculpture in England and published in Dirty Goat. Mountain Song. I have reached my mountains, complete with my echo and one with my image. Let the magic of my poem begin. Night is great, and to spite the blackbirds, the peak covered with snow waits for me, shivering. My absence is clear in ever deepening valleys. I have not echoed for long. Just like the blindness of the endless glazing in my mirror, the dragon waits for me. Here I am, mountain. I am all yours. Here I am, mountain. I am all yours. And this was translated by Fiona Tompkinson, Kemal Atakay, and Cihat Salman. Turkish version is like that. Dağlı şarkı. Dağlarıma vardım. Yankımla tam, suretimle bir. Başlasın şiirimdeki sihir. Gece uludur ve kara kuşlara inat, karla örtülü zirve bekler beni ürpererek. Yokluğum bellidir gittikçe derinleşen vadilerde. Yankılanmam nicedir. Tıpkı aynamdaki sonsuz sırrın körlüğü gibi bekler beni ejder. Da işte geldim seninim. Da işte geldim seninim.
Mete, thank you so much. I'm hearing the word in my head, the English word you'll recognize, incantations, which we think of with spells and wizards, but also literally means canto, right? To sing. And so I feel both of those things in these in the poems. They are incantations, but they also do truly sing. And on behalf of Foothill College and Stanford Gen Channel, I just want to thank you for sharing and staying up late, sharing some poems with us from across the world. It's magical times in which we live, in which we have this opportunity in many ways, although as we were discussing before the show, the pandemic still rages. in Asia, and so it's hard times. But thank you so much, and I learned so much more about you. And now you've got me even more hungry for more poetry. Maybe someone will even be inspired to translate more of your poetry.
Thank you.
After hearing this, because I think there's much more to be done, and much more to be explored. So thank you on behalf of Foothill College in Stanford for being here with us. And
Thank you.
We'll look forward to talking with you in some future time, when maybe even in person someday. Maybe.
Okay. I will
Either I will be in Istanbul or you will be in San Francisco. How about that?
Very happy to hear that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mete.
Welcome. Thank you.